Thank you very much for inviting me to do this talk. It's going to be a bit of a rattle through quite a lot of information. I always seem to put too many things into my slides and get overexcited. The other thing is fair to say is that London's flora is large and complicated and changing at a phenomenal rate. So I very much cherry-picked interesting things and stories that I quite like as of pieces of plant information I've observed over the last few years. First thing from this first slide is you will see that London is sort of smack bang in several layers of recording and observing plants around Britain. So I'm just going to move my cursor over and you can see the red outline of Greater London as it is now today. The almost entirely forgotten historic county of Middlesex, for which I'm the Vice County Recorder. And then the big circle is the all-important LNHS circle, which we also refer to as the polygon. And a lot of the mapping I'm going to be talking about today is in reference to the polygon. So it is a complicated scenario, both geographically, in terms of areas of interest, and the data sharing about where botany records go from the London Natural History Society to regional biological record centres, and then onto the BSBI and the NBN, the National Biodiversity Network, is a talk in itself. And I won't bore you with that anymore because it is somewhat complicated. So I'm really, really pleased to have my, oh, screen's not responding. Come on, why are you not reacting? There we go. That is very, apologies, I do not know.
Don't worry.
Oh, come on. There we go. Apologies, it just stuck then for some reason. My computer sucked. I'm very pleased to have Rodney Burtner, my immediate LNHS and BSBI Vice County Recorder, here this evening. So I'm going to have to tread carefully and make sure I'm even more accurate than normal. So the current LNHS Flora Project is essentially picking up and moving forward from the activities of Rodney and his wonderful team of botany recorders and other key people who collected the data for the London Flora Project, which was published in 1983, but actually has an arc of activity from the early mid-60s right up into the mid-1970s. So one thing you'll get from this is that it takes a long time to produce a flora. Mapping in any individual area of the country, I think there's a rough estimate about 20 years on average for an average British flora. It's a slow and tortuous and painful exercise at times, largely driven out of love and obsession. So the Flora of London area is essentially our baseline data from which we're building on in the 21st century. It has embedded within it, and I'm taking a very strong Middlesex focus because I really can't talk about all of the other literature for the botany of the London area, but for myself specifically, these two important works, the Historical Flora of Middlesex, and then the supplement produced by Dougie Kent. And these in turn are based on earlier literature such as Tryman and Dyer's Flora of Middlesex from 1869. So there is a huge continuity of observing and collecting data. In fact, London has probably got one of the longest continuous records of collecting natural history and botanical information, with some of our earliest records going back until the mid-16th century. So this is a long tradition we have here, and it is a complicated one, and the huge, huge amounts of data that we're trying to compile, because much of this earlier literature is pre the internet, pre-digitization, pre-databases, and transcribing that information and moving it into the new digital world has been a Herculean task. And I'm going to mention very briefly one person because I don't believe he's here, but without Clive Schofield's particular help in pulling out enormous amounts of our historic data, the current London Flora Project would be a lot poorer, but Clive is one of many people that has helped, who I'll come back to later on. Now, quite often when I attend botany meetings, people ask, oh, how are things going with the Flora Project? And I usually break out into a sweat because it's exhausting and there's a lot of complexity going on here. But these 6 maps here will give you an understanding of how well we're doing overall in the London area. These 6 maps are for the main vice counties in the London area. So up in the top left-hand corner, we have Middlesex, or excuse me, Hertfordshire. And then the top centre, South Essex, and then North Essex, apologies. And then East Kent, and that's East Kent, and North Essex, and in the bottom right-hand corner, my county, Middlesex. And essentially, these are heat maps showing you the density of recording. Now, one of the things if you looked up in the top left-hand corner, you can see the arc of the ghost of the LNHS polygon in that particular image. So we're actually doing pretty well in our recording for London area. One of the things I'm directly doing at the moment, because essentially the timelines are more pressing for this, is I'm contributing to the latest BSBI Atlas 2020, which means I'm concentrating on my Middlesex data and number crunching and compiling, tidying up records, deleting errors, sorting out all sorts of things. And I'm basically working through Stacey's flora, starting off with the conifers and arcing my way through until I get to the end, and then we'll need a stiff drink in probably about 10 months' time when I get to the end of the grass family. This is a huge undertaking in itself to go through this data. So we're doing very well in London, actually, for our historic data. Now I'm going to start to show you some individual stories. So all of these maps are essentially derived from the BSBI database system, the DDB. These are the coloured maps, and I'm comparing them and juxtaposing them with the mapping from Rodney Burton's Flora, because they make some very, very interesting stories. Now, first off, it's the purple Peril. I won't rant about it this time, you'll be relieved to hear, but Buddleia davidii is a really important part of our flora now, whether we like it or not. And in the LNHS polygon, we now have 14,500 records for this plant species. So it is very well recorded, and you can see that it is almost entirely ubiquitous, apart from the most rural areas on the periphery of the polygon. Now, if you compare that with the map from the early 1980s, you can see essentially it's telling a story of expansion through the 20th century from greater inner London into the wider countryside. Not surprisingly, because Buddleia is one of our most successful non-native species and is colonising lowland Britain very rapidly. One of the things that is really important to remember is actually the first record for Greater London area and for the polygon was in 1927. So this has happened in less than 100 years. Now, the other thing we can do using the BSBI data is look at the density of recording, and you can see here there's an absolute, I won't go into the detailed figures, but you can get some information about the quantity of recording in any particular area. Huge amount of recording of Buddleia davidii in the centre of the city. So we've got a density of recording. Now, some of that will relate to time periods, how long people have recorded that plant in that area, but also quantity of botanists going out doing stuff. Because you have to remember that all of this data has got errors in it, essentially because we can't get everywhere all of the time. Sometimes somebody forgets to hand their data in and all sorts of reasons why. So it's patchy at times. The other thing is you can see how densely we've been recording some of these plants. So this is Buddleia again in the core of London, and each one of these dots, as you can see, is a really, really fine-grained resolution of, you know, the streets of central London. You can see the hint of an old road, etc., etc. So we've got a great deal of granularity in our recording, as well as this large sweep across the area. Now, one of the things that is happening in London is massive change, huge amount of change. London is changing in terms of its cultural dynamics, its people, its population, the plant communities. Many of the former brownfield sites of London have now been developed with the massive development pressure of the last 30 years, and it is increasingly hard to find plant communities such as this, with such things as hoary mustard, common mallow and mugwort, all of which are actually non-native species, but they've happened to be here for a long time. In the case of the mallow and the artemisia, we've just tend to think of them as native plants, but they're not. They've been with us for several thousand years through the activity of our ancestors and agriculture. Hirschfeldia, hoary mustard, is a much more recent introduction. It's a European native plant, but actually it's doing something incredible quite quickly. Going back to the maps again, you can see Rodney Burton's Flora from 1983, which is essentially recording data from the mid-60s to the early 1970s, a few scattered records. It was quite well established at this point in inner London, but it was by no means abundant. You roll forward the clock to 2020, because this is 2020, up to 2020. We've now got nearly 4,000 records for this species in the London area. And it is very widely spread. So in many ways, it's doing pretty much what Buddleia is, which is following on behind. Now, one of the things I find particularly interesting about this is that many of our native and some of our non-native plants are struggling with pollution in the form of nitrogen. This and Buddleia are two species which seem to be bucking that trend. Now, another lovely thing is, and it's been talked about quite a bit over the last 2 decades, is about the resurgence of various fern species, the wall ferns, the Spleenwood in the Greater London area. And John Edgington, naughty me, I nearly forgot his name then. John Edgington has written quite a lot about it and has contributed a huge amount of records to this endeavour. The maidenhair Spleenwood is a nationally abundant plant, but it's had a difficult time historically in London. It petered out very much in the 19th and 20th century because of pollution, and that can be seen very clearly again from the mapping from the original flora. But again, if you compare that with post 2000 records, it's had a massive resurgence in inner London. And you hear it anecdotally, you hear people like John talking about it, and you talk about it in discussing, but this map shows very clearly that this plant has moved back in to territory and colonized quite large chunks of Greater London, which were 50 years ago deeply hostile to it. So some interesting changes in our native plant communities. And then we get some oddities occurring. There's always oddities. Urban botany is full of oddities. And two curious ones that we've had turn up in Greater London over the last 20 years: a sea spleenwort, which is a plant largely of the southwest peninsula. It's a native British plant, and lanceolate spleenwort with a similar, slightly different distribution. Both of these are coastal, tender plants, very intolerant of frost, and both have turned up, sadly, only for very limited periods of time so far in the Greater London area. The sea spleenwort is still hanging on in a couple of walls in the Waterloo area. The lanceolate spleenwort sadly lost its niche to some very aggressive development in the King's Cross area, so that is now extinct again with us. But both of these plants' movement into the London area indicate, like so many other things, that our climate is getting milder, and in the case of sea spleenwort, saltier in some areas. Now, I just want to dwell on, a widespread plant that, we tend to forget. We're so concerned often with curious non-natives, rare natives. We tend to overlook widespread species. And this I almost stumbled across by accident. So here we have all of the records for Perennial Dogs mercury, often used as an indicator for ancient woodland. It can hang on in old hedgerows and sometimes just pops up in a more weedy sense. Now you can see from both of these maps the total records that's currently in the BSBI database, 4,500 of them, compared to Rodney Burton's Flora, the distribution is quite similar. But something is happening. Here we have more recent data, and you'll see I've gone on the left-hand side, I've got post-1970 records in darker pink, as opposed to all of the records in lighter pink. And you can already see that post-1970, there's a bit of retrenchment. It's pulling away from central London. Post-2000, that has become quite a significant loss, particularly in the north and west of London. Not sure what's happened. Literally, I discovered this today. I was like, oh, that's quite interesting, that we're seeing, probably some quite significant loss of plant species which are native, but not particularly mobile in the environment. and they're losing ground because their environment is probably not as good as it should be for them these days. Probably poor management, lack of management, and again, likely as not, pollution. So there are some really quite significant things happening, even with apparently common and plant species that are doing well. Here's another one that has really, really surprised me. So this is Oxford ragwort, Senecio squalidus, very famous plant with the very famous story of its spread from Oxford. It's a non-native species from southern Europe and has spread wide the length and breadth of the British Isles over the last 300 years or so. And again, you can see from the total records up to 2020, 6,218 or so, it's a widespread plant all across the London area. That is also reflected by the mapping from the 1970s. Again, there's some interesting changes going on. Once more, if we look post-1970, we're starting to see a loss of records and a loss of recordings from parts of the Essex area, parts of, Surrey. Now that may be recorder shifts, maybe people are not recording the plant for all sorts of reasons, there may be other things. So on its own, I would have been a bit like, nah, maybe it's a data glitch, so to speak. But on top of this, when you look at the data coming up right up until the current day, 2020, on the right-hand side, you can see it's quite a profound loss of this plant species from the peripheries of Greater London. And this is something which we talked about anecdotally in London, where people saying, oh, Senecio squalidus seems to be less common in London. We don't see it more that often compared to 20 years ago. We've often put it down to the urban pressure of smartening up cities, tidying canals and development. But this seems to be a widespread phenomenon where for some reason this species is retrenching in parts of the peripheral London. I'm not sure why. I have a suspicion it may be down to glyphosate intolerance, but there are other causes. But it bucks the notion and the trends that we've often seen about Southern European species doing well and expanding, although it's a sort of sub-montane plant. Fascinating, and we need to really work out what's going on here with this plant. A relative of it, formerly in Senecio as well, is Jacobia aquatica. Now, Jacobia aquatica, the marsh ragwort, is a less widespread and frequent relative of ragwort, which is still fairly widespread across Greater London, but even that is probably showing some localised declines in some areas. Now, Jacobia aquatica has always been a relatively scarce species in historic times in the Greater London area, and you can see if you look at the mapping on the right-hand side that it's snaking almost along the route of the less heavily urbanised part of the western reaches of the Thames. It's fair to say that probably right up until the 19th century, this plant was growing right through what is now the centre of Greater London as a plant in the non-salinated, non-saline parts of the River Thames. Another thing you'll notice is that some of these squares, most of these squares are actually 2-kilometre squares. There's a few which are only 10-kilometre squares. What that's telling me is that we don't have particularly accurate information about the location for that. And this is one of the benefits of going back and hunting historic records, because we can track down those records and finesse and refine them and get us a better understanding. So whilst it's a tedious and ghastly exercise hunting out old literature and scanning it, it does give us benefits that we can turn large 10-kilometre squares into a finer resolution record. So this plant is also showing, as a native species, loss. It seems to really be losing quite significantly space and territory in much of the area that's not part of the immediate Thames itself, and many of these sites in the north of London may be really, really small populations with 5, 10, 20 plants. It still seems to be doing reasonably well upon the Thames in the western reaches of Greater London. Now, this is a species which is of great concern, Campanula rotandifer, the beautiful harebell, one of Britain's most loved wild plants, sadly at risk of extinction now in England, thankfully still doing okay in Wales and Scotland, but England it is having a very hard time. Now again, this is the total records for the whole of London. I haven't put a comparison in with the London Flora, but one of the things I want to do is just talk about momentarily about, again, the granularity of recording. Now, if we move forward and just have the post-2000 records, you can see that it's dropped in abundance quite a lot. And actually, even this map is probably being overly optimistic, because I suspect, particularly in some of these scattered areas in the northern part of London, quite a few of these records may be horticultural. One of the difficulties of recording flora in the London areas, we often have heated discussions at times about recording things in gardens. When is something cultivated? When is it not cultivated? When do you peer over a garden fence, etc., etc. So there is always a degree of ambiguity about what the status of some plants are, which need to be looked at more carefully. But it is really, really important that you attempt to record your status of the plant, whether you think it's planted or not, whether you think it's non-native. Because some plant species, the records are so blurred by the failure of recording the presence, its status, such as Cordyline australis, the cabbage tree, that we cannot understand what is happening at the moment. So this is a really important but difficult issue we've got to deal with. So Campanula is probably doing quite poorly. And even so, if you look down in the south of London, but just below Epsom, or the margins of London area, where it looks like it's doing quite well at that higher granularity of 2 kilometre squares, you can see if you look around the Mickleham area, actually, again, these are very small, isolated populations. And I'm pretty convinced that most of those individual dots could be an individual clone or patch of several small clones. This is a plant that is really, really suffering in the Greater London area. I've shown variations of this so many times to various people, but it is a classic, so to speak, but it is also really important because it really does show the interplay between introducing plants through the activity of humanity accidentally, because the early meadowgrass Peril fern was probably introduced into the London area via horticulture, but it is also allegedly a native plant in the far southwest of Britain. And it used to be extremely rare across the whole of the British Isles, with only tiny populations in the Scillies and Lizard Peninsula. Over the last 30 years, its range has expanded massively across the southern part of England, and it is now found fairly widely in the London area. Now, some of that is human activity and introduction, but another element of it is almost certainly climate change, because this is a Mediterranean species that grows in the winter, so it needs mild winters to do well. So this is some of the earliest data for the London area. Actually, David Bevan and I both found it within about 3 or 4 days of each other for the first time, or so we thought at the time, back in 2004, I think it was. But you can see now we've got a few more records up to 2005 scattered around. We believe that this plant is probably spreading through the London area, in part locally, through being attached to the machinery from mowing machinery in local authorities. So a council cuts a site, takes this machinery, this plant's seed, which is sticking to the wheels and the cutting mechanism, then moves into a new location. Islington, for example, it is now really very, very abundant past the city. As you look forward, you can see how much, as we get up to 2015, it started to do really quite well in Greater London itself, that core warm area, and those relatively warm bits of the coast of Essex, apart from when there's a shrill east wind blowing. And up to the current day, we can see greater consolidation. If anything, this plant, which is still poorly understood by botanists in some area, is probably considerably more abundant than this, because people are frightened of recording it. But it's relatively easy to IT once you've got used to it. Other Mediterranean and sort of quasi-Mediterranean plants which are doing well from this movement and enthusiasm for buying large palm trees, etc., from major nurseries in Italy, for example, are plants such as the Mediterranean nettle, the common cudweed, and ramping fumitory. Now, the nettle is a non-native species which first turned up in Britain in 2004. It's now locally frequent in parts of central London, as is this non-native subspecies of the fumaria. The cudweed is a really interesting one because this is considered, long-established native plant that was essentially extinct in Greater London up until very, very recently. Like these other species, it's slowly reappearing, sometimes in very, very urban parts of central London. So we're seeing a complex pattern of losers and winners right across the region. I mentioned earlier Cabbage Tree, Cordyline australis, which is so often recorded by people when they just see it on a street corner, which is okay, but just ticking that box that says planted or saying you're seeing a seedling generate is potentially massively informative, because this is a plant species which is now becoming a fairly common street weed in parts of central London. But unfortunately, because widespread recording of it all over where it's planted means we're not able to really understand the demographics of its naturalization in the area. Similarly, passion flower, which is often people just assume, oh, it's just a casual garden escape, is locally becoming established as an escape in parts of central and east London, and seems to be having essentially self-supporting and regenerating populations, albeit small ones at the moment. This is one of my favourite Londoners, which I was introduced to from its one surviving population in North London by David Bevan, that great hero of London's botany and natural history. This plant is nationally very rare, or is nationally rare and is at risk of extinction. Last time I saw this was in, I think, 2012 or thereabouts, in its one northern London site in Finchley, where there's about 20 plants in 2 or 3 very, very small shallow pools. This plant is at imminent risk of extinction in Greater London, and even the 2 dots in the Surrey area, these are very, very small and vulnerable populations. So we are really facing the imminent extinction of many plants in this area. And this is a long-standing, frankly, tradition, particularly in Middlesex, where we have got some of the worst extinction rates for any part of Britain as things stand. I have a great fondness for pondweeds. They're great things. Every now and then the really small-leaved ones give me the heebie-jeebies, and I can't remember what's what, but they're a fascinating group of plants. We're actually really lucky in Britain and Ireland that we've got more pondweed species than any other part of Europe. We've got every European taxon bar one, I think. It's mainly because it's wet all the time, or it was up until relatively recently. Broadleaf pondweed is a species which, if you look in floras for, or accounts of Britain's wild plants, they will nearly always say common. That's really not the case for Greater London and the surrounding area. Again, here's the total mapping for the BSBI database, and similar distributional pattern for Rodney Burton's Flora, with a few additional gaps filled in here from people actually data mining historic records from other counties. Now, if you look at the mapping as things stand today for post-2000, it's still got that scattered patchy distribution, but it's much, much less frequent. And apart from 1 or 2 areas such as the River Lee, where you can see a line running down just to the to your left of Ilford, this plant does seem to be losing territory. And I fear, particularly for inner London, many of these populations are essentially ephemeral. They're fragments of material that are being washed down from healthier parts of the river systems and tributaries further to the north or to the south, colonising temporarily and then being lost. Certainly all the material in East London, we're looking at a patch that you could almost put in the palm of your hand. So these big dots could mean one plant. So this plant is gradually suffering. Thankfully, we've had some good news on the pondweed. So Potamogeton perfoliatus has turned up in 2 or 3 locations in the far west of Middlesex for the first time in many, many years, which is a relief. Now, let's go on to talk about some beautiful parasites for a while. So this is common cowweed. I suspect for those of you who are familiar with urban botany, you'll be deeply unfamiliar with this plant. If you go to parts of Wales or Scotland or the Sussex Weald, this is a locally very frequent plant. In parts of the southwest England, it is still abundant. It's a beautiful thing. It's a relative of speedwell and other plants such as that. And it is also a semi-parasite. It's hemiparasitic. It has a root system that bolts into the roots of adjoining grasses and nicks food off them. Fascinating plant with a very, very specific ecology. And again, we're seeing some very, very worrying trends. Now, one thing about cowweeds are they generally often referred to as axiophytes, which broadly speaking means highly indicative of old, stable, ancient landscape in many cases, many parts of Britain. Again, you can see on the left this historic data for all the records for the last 300 or so years, 300 records. Some of the data is not very well resolved. We just got big 10-kilometre square blobs. It might say something like, Surrey or something like that in the original data. Now, the picture for this plant is pretty poor. You look at post-2000, 71 records, and it has lost a huge amount of territory in most of the ancient woodlands that it used to be found in, particularly in the north and in the Surrey. There are in Middlesex, as far as things stand, one small population in Ruislip Woods and another tiny and very, very vulnerable population in Queenswood in North London. So this is a species which is not doing well, probably because it is in part needs to be dispersed by ants, and it has this requirement for this very stable environment. Not all of the parasites are doing badly though. Ivy broomrape is actually having a bit of a rather fantastic time. I haven't got the original records and mapping from or information from Rodney Burton's Flora, but the original Flora said, it's found in about 3 or 4 places. Kew Gardens, there's a very old, long-established population, and the Highgate area, and 1 or 2 places in East London. This species has done very well, and it's doing very well across much of southern Britain, probably again because of our climate getting milder. It's associated with ivy, and essentially it's a Mediterranean species. And it's still scarce and patchy, but it is spreading pretty consistently through the London area. Now, we have some problems, and there are all sorts of reasons. Peter Sell referred to some of the trees and shrubs that we have planted in London area and other parts of Britain as lookalikes, where we have things that were planted as common hawthorn, Cryptogams monogyna, and they've turned out to be all sorts of other wonders, such as the large sepaled hawthorn, Cryptogams rhipidophylla. Trouble is, nearly all of the records are Cryptogams monogyna, but just anecdotally observing things in London, a very, very large proportion of the plantings of these plants are rhipidophylla, or the hybrids. It's a bit late to start unpicking all this data, so I'm not quite sure what we're going to do about this, just apart from acknowledging the problem. Another interesting conundrum is Malus sylvestris, the crabapple. Now, Malus sylvestris has had a long history of being confused with the domesticated apple. They're both closely related, and they do hybridize. There's been a lot of debate about this over the last 30 years or so, but there is evidence of hybridization. Unfortunately, many small fruited examples of domesticated apple have been recorded as crabapple, when almost certainly they're not. They're the domesticated apple. Malus sylvestris is probably much, much scarcer than the mapping indicates in the London area, and it is quite rare to find the real thing. One of the things you need to look at is not the fruit, but the undersides of the leaf. What you need to have is small fruit, a nice smooth underside of the leaf. You need to look with a hand lens. If it's got hairs on it, it's likely as not it's going to be a hybrid. So we have a tricky problem there as well. In fact, we have many tricky problems with mapping plants in the London area. Another great success, unfortunately, is the tree of heaven, Ailanthus altissima. This is going to become one of our most severe invasive species over the next 50 years, with problems to human health and also to flood risk management and to the built environment and to biodiversity. So it hails from southern Asia. And again, you can see from Burton's Flora, where he notes that it's actually been recorded as a flower, as a plant from about, I'm just checking my times, naughty me, need to speed up. It's been recorded since the 1930s or so in the London area, but we've seen a massive expansion in the last 20 years. London rocket, I'm going to just check how many more, gosh. Oh yeah, I'm going to speed up. Naughty me, gassing too much. Maria slapped me. So London rocket is a fascinating plant with a long history. It's a non-native species, which, you know, was linked to the Great Fire of London, dwindled significantly through the later part of the 20th and the 19th and early 20th century, but has had a resurgence again over the last 20 years. Probably associated with climate change as central London warms. A couple more winners and losers. Saxifraga tridactylites on left. 20 years ago, I thought this was going to become extinct in London. We had a tiny, tiny fragmentary population. It has now gone through a huge population boom and is locally super abundant, for example, on railway clink on the approaches to many of the large railway stations, particularly in South London. Sadly, its relative meadow saxifrage is having a terrible time and is hanging on by the skin of its teeth in a very few locations, such as Kew Green. Fascinating stories, moment time. So one of the great things that turned up over the last sort of decade or so was finding white hellebrine in Buckingham Palace while surveying the Queen's back garden. First time it's been seen in London, in Middlesex, for about 300 years, apart from one equivocal record up in the Harefield area. Likewise, lizard orchid gave everybody a shock about 12 years ago by turning up in West London, the first time in 300 years or so of recording in North London, and the plant is still there, amazingly, considering how dreadfully the site is being treated. It hangs on and is actually doing quite well. Lots of things are getting mucked up a bit, and we're starting to really lose an understanding of things. Corn, cockle and cornflower are widely planted in these so-called wildflower seed mixes, and understanding their distribution, particularly in the case of cornflower, is become more challenging. And we are certainly seeing a significant loss of the less obvious but incredibly important and rare, less charismatic, shall we say, members of the corn community, such as spreading hedge parsley and annual Norwell. Both of these species are now surviving in tiny, tiny populations in the north of the London area in Hertfordshire. Other things that are doing very well locally but are suffering regional extinction, Scilla autumnalis is still found in a few places in the west of London around Ham House and Hampton Court, but regionally across much of southeast London this species is basically extinct. So our few surviving populations in the London area are increasingly important for this species. Our orchids are having a kind of mixed scenario. Some of the weedier species, which is a bit of a mean thing to say about them, such as pyramidal orchid and bee orchid, are doing quite well and seem to be colonising new parts of London gradually. The green-winged orchid is having a very, very strange time. Wild populations, so to speak, that were in old grassland have gone, but it started turning up. I think we now have 3 records of it turning up on green roofs of all places. So it is finding a new, albeit tenuous, new home in Greater London. Other wondrous rarities that we have a great mystery about what's going on with them is wild licorice. This actually grows on Greenwich Peninsula in one location in Greenwich Ecology Park. We don't know how it got there. It's not on the original planting list for the site. There is actually another site nearby, so I suspect, I have no proof, that this may somehow or other been surviving in that area, but it is rather questionable as to its origins. Now, the marine environment is gradually encroaching on London. A lot has been talked about actually about how London is sinking, North Sea is rising, and the River Thames is getting salty. Sea aster, as we now call it, Tripolium pannonicum, is on the move, as are these other Ceylon plants. So again, you'll see from the Burton's flora that is essentially in the east, but the current mapping showing that it is moving gradually west as the River Thames gets saltier and saltier. We're getting mixed pattern with some of our plants which are smaller denizens of Greater London. Strawberry clover, again, is a plant which 30 years ago people would have been agog if you'd say that there was a risk of extinction in England. It is declining quite rapidly in many parts of the area. There are very few locations left for it in Greater London. We found one tiny patch in West London last year or the year before. And then it has this rather snazzy relative, the woolly clover, which is an annual, unlike the other one, which is a perennial, which grows in one location in Blackheath. We still have no idea how this non-native species from southern Europe got right in the middle of Blackheath of all places, but it's now joined the rather fabulous community of rare clovers that site is important for. We're seeing all sorts of new pressures. We're seeing tree planting affect many of our habitats, and this is having really quite potentially dire consequences. Dyer's greenweed is another very vulnerable species. One of the last sites for it in London is in Horsenden Hill area, and part of the area which would have been suitable for this species to live in has recently had trees planted. Again, this is a nationally scarce species now, which is at risk of extinction in England. So we have now probably 3 or 4 viable sites left for it in inner London, Greater London. Other plants, members of the mint family, Spanish fisher with a few pretties. I am nearly there, I promise. And we're seeing some kind of interesting things. We've got marsh woundwort, which is nationally a pretty common plant, but not very common in London, hanging on in parts of the West London on the canals and doing reasonably well. Wood sage has suffered a catastrophic loss in its sites in North London over the last 100 years. It is now a very, very rare plant over much of the northern part of Greater London, although it's still locally frequent in the southern reaches. And in the middle, lesser callopin, famously only found in Lesnes Abbey Wood, although one new site recently turned up. Very nearly there. And just to finish on a good bit of news, tower mustard, nationally scarce species again, only found in Lesnes Abbey Wood, recent discovery there on one site in the west of London, Staines Reservoir. So we're seeing a complex patch of winners and losers, things thriving and other parts fading away. And just to end, this talk could not have happened without bandy need enthusiasts such as this lot here. Thank you very much. Oh, are we on question time now, Julia? Can't hear Marie. Can't hear you.
Yeah, we should be. I should be unmuted now. Thank you so much, Mark. That was really interesting, and such a range of different stories of different patterns, and the way there are kind of the winners and the losers, and it's often quite complex to work out why those plants are changing in the ways that they are. Right, I've noticed there was quite a lot of activity on the chat, and I think David, are you checking the chat? There seem to be already some questions coming through, so should we start with those?
Yeah, I can put some of those. So there was a question from Catriona first. I'll just read it out. So Catriona asked, are there any programs for growing some of the more threatened species?
Very good question. I fretted about this. It would be really good to get something going in London. So some of you who are BSBI members might know a chap called Joshua Stiles up in Lancashire, who's a powerhouse of botanical skill and enthusiasm. And he's essentially set up a regional program for vulnerable plant species in northwest England, particularly Lancashire. I would like to see the same happen in London. It's just a matter of capacity. The only thing that we have done a rescue mission on so far was actually marsh sow thistle, which we saved from extinction in the London area about a decade ago. So if you're offering, Catriona, let's have a chat.
Thank you, Mark. What else do we have? We had a question from Giuseppe about, do you have examples of species naturalised in London and how climate change modified the distribution of London flora?
I think there's a very, very long list, Giuseppe, and I indicated one or two of them, such as Poa infirma. We are seeing non-native species massively move, and I very nearly put it in, but I thought I've just got too much. So one of them is water bent, Polypogon viridi, which is a European, essentially Mediterranean species, which has been long established in Britain. Now, Burton's Flora, it's very interesting. I went back and had a quick look at that. It's so rare before 1983, well, 1976, because that's the last data recording, that Burton just says there is one record for it as a casual. It is now one of London's most successful street grasses, and it's often referred to as the most rapidly spreading plant or most rapidly spreading grass in Britain. This has gone through a massive and profound change. One of the problems is that all of this information about climate change when it comes to Britain's flora is essentially anecdotal, because getting funding to do proper empirical research on this is well nigh impossible, just tragically. So we've got, one of the ironies is in Britain is we've got a huge data set that could be used for testing these hypotheses, probably better than virtually anywhere else on the planet, with a time frame that's much longer than anywhere else on the planet. And we have a funding environment which is essentially disinterested and hostile to using biological data for this kind of research, broadly speaking.
Yeah.
Okay.
Kieran, do you want to?
Yeah, I just had a very quick question for Mark. I genuinely don't know the answer to this, so I was curious.
That's good. That's good questions.
Yeah, so we've set up an iRecord activity for gathering ad hoc data for LNHS. And I was just wondering, if people submit plant records within the London area to iRecord, does that naturally get through to the BSBI recorders, the LNHS recorders?
Yeah, now I've got to think there is a mechanism for it, for iRecord, and what's the other I? There's iRecord and iNaturalist. I always forget the two I's. There is a mechanism where we can pull them in, and in fact, actually, I did a big pull of data in from that source. So yes, and one of those large-scale recording programs has got a technical issue, which is challenging, that the BSBI are trying to resolve. But yes, there is essentially a pipeline where the data can go in, but because the BSBI's gatekeeping system is the Vice County Recorder, it's up to the individual Vice County Recorder to say, yes, I want that data and we'll pull it in or not. So I've pulled in what I could for Middlesex. As I say, it is an exceptionally complicated data recording scenario for London.
Yeah, my reason was for asking, because if it's not, then I can send on the data that comes through our specific activity. But it looks
I think we need to chat about that more specifically, because I just need to check my background facts right about which, what, how, and just check with BSBI. But I very recently did essentially a data import of about 12,000 records. So yeah.
Okay, we've got time for a couple more questions. If anybody else would like to ask one in person, please, you can give us a wave, or just put your virtual hand up. We'll just keep an eye out for that. So that, and I think
well, Rodney's waving.
Yes.
Years ago, when you took over from me, you were keen on looking forward to producing a publication to take over from mine. We haven't heard anything much about that for quite a while. Is it still a live project, and if so, how much longer is it going to go on for?
Well, the London Flora Project is definitely still live. This work has been part of that. The whole point of all of this activity about compiling and pulling all this data in, and the recent recording from over the last 10 years with the LNHS, is getting the data in ready for Atlas 2020. When that data is tidied, it basically opens the gateway to me writing the flora. But as you well know, writing a flora is a 15 to 20 year activity. And I kind of made the announcement about doing this about a decade ago. So I'm probably about halfway through And I will be starting to write accounts probably later this year once I've finished tidying up the data for Atlas 2020.
Yeah.
But I think one of the other things is that the granularity of what we're recording is at 1 kilometre square or less, compared to the period when your project was running, and we have fewer people. It is a lot harder these days, and the data management scenario is much more complicated. I spend a lot of time invisibly crunching data. We have moved hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of records over the last few years to tidy things up.
I also think one of the things that's going to be really good is this having all that historical data in that digital form as well, which is something we've never had before.
Historical data is immensely important because it helps you understand change.
There's just a
couple more in the chat if you want.
Yeah, we do those, David, and then that will.
So I'll take the two. Any more questions? I don't have time for. So we've got a question from Ernie Thompson.
Hi, Ernie.
Who's looking to do some abundance mapping on a small reserve and was wondering what would be the best software to use to do that.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I don't know, Ernie, I'm afraid. I'll have to have a chat about that separately.
Yeah, fair enough. And one from Liz Andrew. It's got a scientific word in it. I'm going to pronounce this now. Does the Hirschfeldii hoary mustard? That's it. Hirschfeldii hoary mustard you showed earlier follow the river?
No. So the earlier data seems to be in that kind of more semi-riverine kind of central. That was probably basically heat island effect. It has now skipped out of those boundaries, and you can find it on pretty much any suitable piece of ground that's nutrient poor or relatively nutrient poor in London. You know, it's found a long way away from the river. Hi, Sheila.
Okay, I'll let one last question in because I think it's an important question, which was from Kathy Wilson. What's your preferred method for people submitting records to you?
One of the things we've not been able to do for all is get a online recording facility through the LNHS. I mean, one of the things I have to remind everybody is that all of us doing this are volunteers, and it is extremely time consuming. Best thing is you can email me, contact me via, and I can send you a template for sending the data as a spreadsheet for me to upload to the Regional Biological Records Centre, and I essentially mirror that data to the BSBI. I try not to retain any data myself now, apart from as a clearinghouse, because I'm a botanist, not a data cruncher, and I'd rather let the Biological Records Centre and the BSBI do that for me, because it is now an enormous task. But yeah.
Great. Okay, thank you so much for that, Mark. I want to, thank you again, and I'm sure everybody has really enjoyed the talk. It's been fantastic. Just a reminder then that we've got another talk coming up in a couple of weeks' time. That will be on the 15th of September, when Kieran Brown will be talking about I Record LNHS. So that's nice that we've started to talk about that this evening. It's a really useful tool that we want to encourage people to use. We've already got other events organised as well, so please have a look at the website for details and sign up to our mailing list. We hope to see you again at one or all of the meetings, and I'd just like to give Mark one last clap. If people want to unmute themselves and say goodbye, that would be great. So thank you very much, and thanks to everybody for coming as well.
Thanks for attending.
Thank you. Thank you.